Hello, everyone. Just making sure the stream here actually has some good audio in it and people can hear me correctly. Hoping everyone can. Looks like we have 5 people joining right now. We have Kevin Hamilton saying good evening, everyone. Evening, Kevin. And of course, we have the wonderful Macy Frazier. Hello, Macy. Yeah, guys. So for everyone listening right now, Alexander is off in, I think it's Lexington, Kentucky for the annual Cryptid-Con this year, which I don't know if it's his first time or not, but it's certainly a very exciting thing for him to be attending. So I'm hoping he has a very good time. I know he live streamed it a bit yesterday. Oh, excuse me. So I'll be taking over the stream for tonight. We have Mind Muscle Millie saying howdy. Hello, glad to see you're here. Yes, so I'll wait for a little bit to just make sure that everyone joins the stream. Fix up my hair a little bit because, you know, long hair problems. All right. Hope everyone's night is going very well. We've got New Hampshire Sasquatch in. Hello, New Hampshire Sasquatch. And we have Teflon. Hello. Probably a big celebrity there now. I imagine he must be with Beyond the Trail and everything. You know, he's just he's going right to Hollywood, that guy. We have Robin Moonshadow coming in. Hello, Robin. Very nice to see you. Very, very nice. For those who are unaware, Robin does a lot of really great research on Bigfoot as well as little people sightings. And she is featured in my new documentary called Wildman of the Wampanoag, which is, in fact, over on the Crash Course Cryptozoology YouTube channel. So if everyone wants to go check that out and be able to see her talk about her studies, it's a really fascinating segment. So I really recommend that. Or just look at her, you know, online in general. Chain Reaction says hello. Matt Barnes saying, hey, everybody. Good to see so many people tuning in. Good, very good to see it. Find myself short of breath for some reason, so I apologize for some pauses in the stream today. We'll wait just like 2 more minutes or so just to make sure everyone can get in. Sandra Piper and Glenn H. coming in. 2 really cool people. Absolutely. From Cape Cod, look at that. Not too far away from me in New Hampshire. And of course, Sandra's always a joy to see in chat. Always a joy. Maybe, Robin, maybe. It's funny. All right, well, it looks like we're teetering out on numbers, which is really good. Let me just get my presentation all set then. And let's make sure it doesn't go like last time where I don't share my screen for a good portion of the presentation. The presentation includes some really exciting news that I'm really glad to be sharing. So I hope that it turns out to be as exciting as I'm excited for it. JP Merrick Sasquatch out of the bathroom. That's funny. There we go. All right, we'll give it another 30 seconds or so, and then I'll start the presentation up. All right, so let's see. I should be sharing the screen. So if I do it like this, how does that look? No, okay. Here we go. Okay, so share screen. Share screen. I do want the entire screen. Okay, so it looks something like this, and I would probably prefer it to look like this. Okay. That sounds awesome, Robin. Yeah, please do send it to me when you get the chance to. All right, I think we are just about ready to see this here. I am going to put it into full screen here, and I just want to test the waters again to make sure that everyone can see this properly. So I'll give it a second, and then I'm going to take a look at the chat. Can someone tell me if seeing that full screen works? Was that looking okay? All right, sweet. Okay. So I'll go back into that then, and I'll start up the presentation here. So I'm, for one thing, again, very glad to see everyone here in the chat today. And what I want to talk about today is something I think that, I think a lot of things about it, I suppose, but maybe paramount among those thoughts are two questions or two notions, which is that I feel as though cryptozoology is something that we don't tend to see discussed very much in, let's say, academic circles or academia in general. And you could extend that perhaps to education in general. And maybe the question is, well, should it be involved? And how can that happen? If the answer is yes, of course. And I want to say a few things, I suppose. For one thing, obviously, this presentation is about the role of cryptozoology in education, in the sense of cryptozoology as an educational subject, perhaps, but also I think the role that cryptozoology plays, that it doesn't get, what would you say? That it doesn't get maybe the recognition it should be getting for. So I want to discuss that. And part of that is some pretty interesting news that's come my way recently in the past few months, which I've yet to announce on any platform, but that I'm very excited to share. I just want to make sure that everyone can see this okay. Yep, everyone's still seeing it. Great, great, great. Okay, so I'm going to actually go on with the presentation then. So this is my presentation on that subject. And I'm starting it off with some really great news, which is that I'm actually going to be teaching a cryptozoology course online at the Housatonic Valley Regional High School in Connecticut in the United States. So a bit about Housatonic Valley. They've got several regions, or districts rather, and I'm teaching in District 1, I believe it is. And it's an enrichment course, which essentially means that you don't get college credits, let's say, for the course ahead of time, like you would maybe some other higher level courses. But what you do get is essentially, it looks good on a resume for a college. Any enrichment course is something that colleges like to see on students' resumes. So what that allows for is more freedom of subject matter in enrichment courses, because they don't need to fit a specific set system that a student might end up going along the path towards. So yes, I'll be teaching an actual, real, in the course catalog, registered cryptozoology class at this high school for students 18 and up in an enrichment course. There's a lesson plan made, there's a syllabus made, and I'm really, really very excited to start this. And, I don't want to make it about me, but I would like to note, it's an immense honor to be able to do this with this subject, but let alone any subject, at the age that I'm at. I'm still in college myself. So having this opportunity to begin an educational career path is something that I would have never in my entire life anticipated. And I'm just really, I'm honored. I'm honored and I'm humbled. So that's really great news. So the thing about that, though, and the point that I want to kind of ease into before I get into answering any questions that anyone might have, because I do want to answer questions throughout this. The question I want to ask is, how does that really happen, though? Because we've talked about this question of cryptozoology in education, not just about why it's not typically in education. We've asked why not. We've asked why it should be, if the answer is yes, and how that would happen. And this is the subject that I do want to cover before I look into questions. So how does cryptozoology fit into a school? For starters, I think maybe a good broad way of noting it is, or defining it rather, is to say cryptozoology is at the very least, it's a gateway to other sciences. And I really do think that one could make a really good case for that, a really sound case, because for one thing, to conduct cryptozoology, a lot of it is analysis and investigation when you're looking at photographs, video, eyewitness testimony. And so immediately you get into the scientific method and Occam's razor. For those unfamiliar, Occam's razor is a sort of all-encompassing rule for a scientific inquiry that essentially states, well, if the answer is hard to discern, try going with the smallest leap in logic first, because that will tend to be at least very close to the answer. And of course, we've discussed this idea too, that opens the gateway to other sciences as well as cryptozoology itself. And this is a subject that I call crypto-connectivity. And this is the last slide that I'll show before I get into any questions. And this is a concept that I covered when I spoke at last year's online Lizardman Festival, the Bishopville Lizardman Festival. And what the concept states is that not just cryptozoology, but any branch of science doesn't exist on a branch, but rather in the middle of a web. So you see here in this diagram, you've got all of these icons with the spider web graphics behind them, and they're linking together. And the question is, well, what does that represent? The representation here is of these icons as different sciences, but they're connected in academic ways. So here's an example. Let's say you were looking at of course, in the center, you have this Nessie icon. That's cryptozoology. Look in the upper left side, and you have this icon of a lion's head. Let's call that zoology. To really have a really good understanding of zoology, what is it you need to understand? You need to understand animals, which makes sense. What that extends into, though, is, well, how does one understand animals without understanding, let's say, what's a good example? Anatomy of an animal, or what separates species in a zoological range, or how blood circulates differently in different types of animals. And for that, you would maybe perhaps travel to the left of the lion's head where you have biology. So to understand zoology, you should be able to understand at least some concept of biology. So those two things are linked. And just like those two things are linked, to understand something like archaeology, or rather perhaps even to understand something like biology, you need to have a good grasp on the past, the records of the past, perhaps you could call it, that show us how the mechanisms of life have changed over time, the patterns that we see emerge in an evolutionary line. And that is what archaeology and paleontology brings us into. So to understand biology over here, you also would have to have a rough concept of what we see in terms of biology in the fossil record for animals. So that gets us into paleontology. And of course, you could argue that paleontology, especially in dealing with things like the prehistoric cryptids, ties into cryptozoology as well. On the other side, you have things like here, sociology, cultural anthropology, or anthropology in general, psychology. Are cryptids a psychological phenomenon? If they are, why? And does cryptozoology, in some perspective, exist as a middleman in that sense, in this infinite series of scientific webs? So is it the case that to really have a good grasp of cryptozoology, you need to envision it only partially as a cross-section of something like zoology and psychology? Perhaps that's what folklore is, you could even argue, or at least cryptozoological folklore. So we have all of these intersecting ideas. And this is what crypto-connectivity is. It's the diagrammic argument that cryptozoology exists at the center of many sciences, but not because it's cryptozoology, even though that is one of the reasons, but because all sciences actually build off of each other and exist in that web, which essentially states in a cryptozoological class, part of what a student should be able to be taught or to be informed on is the basics of all of these other sciences that connect directly to cryptozoology. So that's the idea of crypto connectivity. And I want to look over at the, if we have any questions here. So let me just go back to single. Here we go. Congratulations. Thank you, Robin. And thank you very much, Kevin, as well. Thank you to everyone, to Glenn. And Matt says, congratulations, you have a passion for the subject, so you will easily be an excellent teacher for one. Well, thank you very much. That means a great deal to me, Matt. Thank you. Robin says, it's such an important part of science that is so overlooked. In regards to proof, video, photos, biosamples, evidence for any other animal except critters, especially in regards to Bigfoot. Yeah, absolutely. Evidence is evidence. Facts are facts, except when it comes to cryptids. And it should be applied to even cryptids, and it's not. It's ignored. That has to change. I definitely agree. There's a portion of this presentation where I'll talk a bit about the scientific process, not just in terms of what could be, but what has already been. So I think that'll be a really good kind of segue into that sort of thing. And Stag Shift says, getting into Bigfoot inevitably got me into anthropology and primatology. Exact same situation with me. Bigfoot is what got me thinking about, well, we're considering this question of what would the word be? Because I don't want to exclude possibilities there. Well, essentially what we're talking about is either human or non-human, a primate of some kind. And we're discussing the possibility of a very anthropoid primate that has some similarities to known species like people, or you could say, behavior patterns like the chimp, or anatomical patterns like the gorilla. And the question is, well, how do you begin to understand the question of how that might be if you don't understand the source material, perhaps? So, there's a certain way to put that, I think. I always go to behavior for the example because I find the behavior reports fascinating myself. And I always think, well, this wouldn't be nearly as fascinating if people weren't reporting behavior that lines up very directly with specific chimpanzee behaviors. And that takes some knowledge of behavioral primatology. And like you've mentioned as well, anthropology in terms of studying human anatomy, human evolution. There's a really intriguing aspect of that does seem like it gets overlooked a lot, and well, maybe it shouldn't be. So if no one's got any questions, I will be moving on in the presentation. But yeah, I'm happy to see that people are excited about this prospect, because I don't know that a school has taught this before. It probably has, but this might be one of the first times. And it feels certainly very strange to kind of to partake in that process, I suppose. Let's see what Robin said here. Anthropologists have trouble putting new fossil finds in a category too. Yeah, that is one thing that's interesting, right? Is that the more that we dig up of a fossil record, the more that we have to, it seems, expand our understanding of the fossil record as it happens. Something as monumentous as when we first discovered the first fossilized ancient human remains, or something more recent like the Dragon Man finding with the larger species that we've discovered of ancient humans. It kind of adds a new member to the order, but it also kind of shakes it up a little bit, because we see more diversity than we were planning on working with before, necessarily speaking. So it's an ever-changing process in that way, especially in regards to fossils. JC says, I think of it in general terms of an unknown unidentified large mammal in North America. Yeah, John Bindernagel called it a mammal as well. And I think that that's a really... It's just a good broad way of putting it. Because even though John Bindernagel, may he rest in peace, was certainly of the primate persuasion in terms of his opinion on the animal, he didn't seem to push that. He explained it in very sound terms. And that I think that's one of the pieces of language he used that really kind of helped drive that home. JC also says, something to think about is an issue I brought up somewhere else a bit. With all the stories out there, a clever person with a bit of background could create a pretty good story. It's a factor. Yeah, absolutely. That is one thing that gets into the whole crypto connectivity, right? It's like, well, a lot of this isn't just physical studies of animals. It's also talking to alleged eyewitnesses. So what that might indicate is a need to understand psychological processes of people who have had unusual things happen to them versus people who perhaps are trying to imitate having an unusual thing happen to them. Criminal psychology gets into that quite a bit with, recognizing patterns of speech that indicate that someone's concocting a story as they speak or something along those lines. Yeah. Here's another good one. No more straight line from ape to man, but a tree of many branches. Yes, absolutely. Someone even noted in an anthropology class that I took last year, it's even more like a bush than it is a tree now, because really what it seems to do is just wind further and further, which makes sense because we're dealing with untold amounts of years, millions of years for these mutations to be taking place that would stick around in a population, which is essentially what evolution is. And it's just the amount of species that we don't know anything about in the fossil record will always be very high, because the chances that an individual even fossilizes is actually rather low. So, the diversity that we'll see in the future is probably functionally unlimited, is what I would say. So, absolutely. So let me go back to the presentation here and kind of start off with, we're gonna kind of start delving into, well, this is all, good and fun, but how does one actually approach this in a classroom setting? What is the syllabus going to look like? What is the lesson plan exactly here? And I'm hoping that this will kind of give an idea into what each class will look like. And it's only 5 classes, actually. What the plan is to people will sign up, maximum of 25, I think it is. And it runs from March to April next year. It's all online on Zoom. And it's only 1 class per week on Wednesdays. So there's only 5 classes, as in 5 sessions. So it's definitely something introductory. The class itself, by the way, is called Exploring the Science of Cryptozoology. So even though this is kind of an introductory course, I think that it will really give people a good window into several concepts, which is what cryptozoology is functionally, the approaches that can be taken, and what it means to be a contributing, a scientifically contributing member of cryptozoology. I don't know if that's exactly the right way to put that, but I don't want to use the word cryptozoologist necessarily, so maybe we will just go with that. So let me pull back up my screen sharing here. Here we go. Okay. And again, after each section, I will be looking and see if anyone has any questions or any comments, anything like that. So we've just covered this whole concept of crypto-connectivity. So what is it going to look like? What I want the first class session to be is something that's very, again, these are high school students, so not dumb, but something that's a good, smooth introduction. These are not people who are, in all chances, exceedingly familiar with the subject. So a lot of it will be asking questions. What are students already familiar with? What do they recognize as let's say, denoting cryptozoology? And maybe some fun activities. Do they have any particular cryptid cases, or just cryptids in general, since those tend to get more popular than the cases themselves, that draw them into this subject? Why are they taking the class? What intrigues them about this? What is it about this class that they went into it wanting to experience? What intrigues them? And classes are 2 hours long each. So there's certainly a bit of time in this opening class to really get an idea of just a lot of things that other class sessions might not end up covering exactly. So hopefully that can be something that is dragged to the full extent, not having to kick and scream, and instead will be a very interesting and engaging experience for students. Now, the second class that I want to kind of introduce people with is almost something like a history course. These are just a few of the people that I want to cover. It might be all that I end up having time to cover, considering like I can only dedicate one class to this. But I want to talk to my students about not famous. Famous isn't the right word. We'll say scientifically significant cryptozoology contributors or researchers who are ranging from still with us to no longer with us. So some people, like the three you see in the center here, that being Herman Registers, John Bindernagel, and my friend Scott Martis, who are all unfortunately no longer with us, but made massive scientific contributions to the field through their writings and through their own records of their experiences with this phenomenon that we call cryptozoology. So someone like John Bindernagel is a really good example of just a tried and true academic who saw the value of at least one branch of cryptozoology, and that being the study of the Sasquatch, North American Sasquatch to be exact. And Bindernagel was also just such a good model of a scientist. He was a very, experienced naturalist. You could argue that he was really kind of an unlabeled anthropologist because he spent so much time, talking to people and recording their stories and studying the behaviors of people. He spent time in Africa doing that when he was younger. And of course, also a little known fact about him, he worked on, I believe it was the Environmental Council for the UN for a short time in his life. So this was somebody who was very significant. And I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Scott Martis. He just passed recently. Scott wrote a lot of papers. He especially was, I don't know at what point you call somebody a naturalist really, but it's crazy he wasn't, as far as I know, someone who had an official degree. If any of you would like to kind of get an idea of the knowledge that Scott really had at his fingers, I would recommend watching 3 different podcasts. Either his podcast, which is called The Haunted Sea, and that was on Monster X Radio. I have a podcast episode with him called, the Crash Course Cryptozoology podcast. And there's also a podcast with him on the Bizarre Base channel on YouTube. And the man could talk forever about really any question you gave him. He was a very knowledgeable person. And in that sense, he really kind of defined the broad perspectives that we can kind of work with now when looking at a lot of aquatic cryptid cases. And then you have the black and white photo, very little known cryptozoologist or cryptozoology contributor, Herman Registers, who worked on the Mokele Mbembe case. And he's interesting because he broke and redefined the paradigm of Mokele Mbembe in some ways, and especially, I think, on African cryptid stories, which are often kind of painted as saurian stories, but don't always turn out to be that. He also came back to the States with as far as I know, the most potential evidence for some kind of large aquatic animal. So I'm actually going to do a video on him very soon. So hopefully that will give audiences a good idea of who exactly we're talking about when we're talking about Herman Registers, because again, he's not very talked about at all. You have people like Anna Karac, who are kind of dipping their toes a bit into cryptozoology. She's a primatology researcher, and she has discovered, I think, at least one, perhaps several species of slow lorises, which are a type of small tree-dwelling primate and a bush-dwelling primate, actually, as well. Some of them are called bush babies. And, her work is absolutely fascinating. And she's done presentations on the Yeti before and just talking about what people talk about when they talk about the Yeti, the fossil record in terms of things like the Yeti. Very fascinating person. I believe she won a cryptozoology award 2 years ago, or she was lined up to, and couldn't make it to the ceremony, something along those lines. And then you have people who have just this massive global perspective, like Doug Hychuk, who is the former producer of Monster Quest. And, Doug's team was the first group to be able to film Architeuthis in its natural environment, for one thing. And his work on Monster Quest is just kind of unparalleled in terms of just the broad strokes of perspective brought into a really scientific light for cryptozoology. So in terms of scientific cryptozoology, Doug's work is kind of a champion. So those are some people that I hope to talk about with students in this class. Let's see what some people are saying. We'll take a small break there and talk about anything anyone's saying in chat. Yeah, we got some really interesting stuff here from JC. One of the things I would consider including in teaching a subject like this, why would there be an unknown cryptid in that space? Then go into niche in biology. Nature hates a void. Yeah, I think that's a really good point too. I was having a discussion with somebody about that kind of same thing and talking about the branching out. And it's like, well, it seems as though sometimes we oversimplify the explanation for diversity of species in zoology. We often ask, well, why evolve this way or why evolve that way? And it's not necessarily that kind of question, because evolution isn't the thing that selects. That's more of what nature does. And even then, not as we understand it, at least, and I'll leave that is, as a conscious selection, it's more like, well, how is this mutation going to play out in a world like Earth? And some play out well, and a lot of them don't. So when we're talking about what you're talking about, JC, nature hates a void. Yeah, and people, I think, don't understand that it's not that animals evolve for a particular reason. Features evolve, and they either stick around or they don't, depending on how well they just happen to end up playing out in terms of the environment. And I think that really kind of, it broadens people's it resets people's perspectives on weirder sides of nature. Because it's not a matter of asking why a lot of the time, it's a matter of asking, well, why not? So there's that for sure. And, Robin, good point as well. Big opening. What makes a cryptid a cryptid? Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. And there's different perspectives on that too. So getting into perspectives is maybe even a bit beyond first introduction, but hopefully that can be touched upon a bit. And here's a sentiment that I agree with wholeheartedly. John was a great loss for us Canadians. He was such a nice man, willing to talk to you whenever he could. He was disturbed that science ignored and overlooked Sasquatch and all the evidence there is. Could not agree more. It was such a... I'm so glad that Bindernagel got to do all of the things that he got to do, because really, when we're talking about standing on the shoulders of giants, when I think of those giants, I think of John Bindernagel and people like John Bindernagel. So, absolutely, yeah. Let's see. Yeah, here's a good point. It's, in terms of the big cat populations that really at this point kind of seem to be naturally or otherwise present in Britain. Big cats fill a void. Big cats fill an ecological niche in that area. So there's the question. It's not maybe so much a question of why. It's like, well, we can get into the how. It's like, why not? Why, if a population of big cats happened to escape, or however else they ended up in the countryside, why wouldn't that population continue? There's ample opportunity for it, ecologically speaking. So here we have an interesting comment from Chuck Gonzalez. What about the rope and a flying, glowing lizard, a type of pterosaur? I've seen it. That gets into saurian cryptozoology. And it also kind of gets into broadening perspectives on what we might typically think of zoology. And I'm not trying to debate your citing, to be perfectly transparent there. I'm talking about the subject of someone who's had a sighting like that in an educational sense. It's like, okay, so very strange category for something to fit in. Ecologically speaking, is there a niche to be filled with that kind of thing? Is that a biological possibility? What other sightings do we have that are consistent with that? And another question might be, when we look at, especially, I think, saurian cryptids, there was, I forget who, but someone who mentioned the term neosaur. And I was a bit confused by it. And they explained to me, well, neosaurs is a word that they had come up with, but it was a concept that convergent evolution is something that we should consider when talking about prehistoric cryptids. Are we looking at prehistoric survivors, or are we looking at unknown species that happen to greatly resemble prehistoric survivors? And I think that that's a really interesting notion. And I don't know what else to say on that, so I'll leave that there. Kevin asks, what big cats are in England? There are, if you look up alien big cats, there are a lot of reports of things like, what you might call a mountain lion, or a yeah, here we go, melanistic panthers or leopards. And one of the main theories, and I think this is, if I'm not mistaken, been historically documented in a few cases, not in all of them, but in a few, that a lot of these seem to be populations that are descendant of escaped exotic pets. And again, if there's a niche to be filled and something comes along that can fill it, it probably will fill it. So something like big cats, there's ample opportunity for sure. So, Kevin, whenever I get a blister, I'm going to call it my neosaur. That's clever. I like that. So, yeah, very interesting discussion about survivors, both contemporary and prehistoric-esque. So let's move on to the next part of the presentation here. Let me share my screen. Okay, so moving on from, we'll call it significant cryptozoologists, or again, cryptozoology contributors, we move on to what I think will prove to be, or I hope, I should say, will prove to be a really interesting and cool part of the presentation of this class, which is teaching at least the baseline ways that people can examine evidence. Because we're living in a world right now where Photoshop and, Photoshop skills are a bit above a good deal of people, because people don't typically work with Photoshop. But it does have very easy access. There are programs online that are just like Photoshop that are totally free to use, and they're browser-based, so you don't even need to download anything. It's very easy to manipulate pictures these days. And even then, to manipulate the data found in a picture. You could have a picture taken 90 years ago, if you had a digital copy of it, that you could go in with just a simple Windows standard program, edit the metadata to say that it was taken 2 days ago. So it's difficult sometimes when dealing with especially photographic evidence, because this isn't in the realm of physical evidence. This is mainly photographic evidence, videos, still pictures or otherwise. It's important to understand what really is, what are you looking at when you look at an alleged picture of a Sasquatch, or of, let's say, a ropin, or of a Tasmanian tiger, a surviving Tasmanian tiger? Is this an old thylacine image that just got edited to make it look like it was taken a month ago? Is there ways that we can find signs of photoshopping happening in a picture? If so, can we track down and figure out the process for what happened? That's a bit more advanced. There is an activity that I planned for that, but I want to give everything away for that, because that goes into a different project that I'm also working on. But I do have a really good example here that I think really highlights well what you sometimes deal with in cryptozoology in terms of analyzing a photo. And it's something like this. So what does this say? A woman took this photo of an unidentified animal along the banks of Bayou Bon ID on Monday afternoon as she was headed to meet her husband, who was working in a field east of Mer Rouge. The man said he had seen extremely large footprints from some type of animal in the area on several occasions. So let's do a bit of a scholastic activity here. Let's pretend like we're a class in a cryptozoology course, and I'll let this sit on the screen for just a few more seconds. And I would love to know everyone's thoughts on this picture. So let's go into single here. So having seen that photo, what does everyone think? What are some first analyses that we might think of when looking at that? Hello, Brian Chu. Welcome to the stream. Robin says, my late father-in-law was from England, and before he passed, he told me he saw a black leopard when he was a kid. Yeah, a lot of stories are from the older generations. I recall on Monster Quest, cases of people being allegedly stalked by panthers and things like that. So we have a few answers already. We have Kevin Hamilton saying it's reversed Patty. We have someone saying it's like a guy in baggy clothes. Does anyone else have any thoughts? I don't mean to what would the word be? To force anyone into a classroom setting here. I kind of want to give an example of the kind of activity that might be conducted in this class. So, Peyton, you missed it? Okay, yeah, let's take another look at the image really quick here. I'll leave this on for the next, 20 seconds or so. So let's get a good look at this. Again, the description says, a woman took this photo of an unidentified animal along the banks of Bayou Bonadi on Monday afternoon, as she was headed to meet her husband, who was working in a field east of Mer Rouge. The man said he has seen extremely large footprints from some type of animal in the area on several occasions. So if you can, too, get some specifics on what exactly might be wrong here, if anything is wrong. Leave it on for a few more seconds. I've already got a few things to point out. Let's see what some people are saying. Oh, shoot. I forgot to share it. Look at that. Silly me. Let me share it again for just 10 more seconds. I'm very sorry about that. So that's what we're looking at. And again, take it in a little bit. Give it 10 seconds. Okay. Oh, was it on the screen that time? Was it on the screen that time? Because it said that I was sharing my screen, but I'm not sure if it was. Can someone let me know if that was on the screen that time or if I missed it again? Okay, it seems like it seems like we did get to see it that time because some people are putting in more opinions there. Okay, so yeah, we've got some really good, analyses here. So for instance, Robin over here says, I'm going to get kicked out of the class for what I'm thinking about this pic. JC says, look at the shadows to ensure they are relative to the ambient light. People insert images all the time and don't think about that. Very good point. And it's along the same lines as what Kevin Hamilton said, clearly a cut and paste job. Chuck Gonzalez says there's no feet. Both really good points. Let's scroll down and see what else we have. Okay, everyone saw it. Good. The description of tracks is non-specific and doesn't really match the pic. Right. We have, there's no definition outside the head and arms. We have the arms look too skinny for the size. Yeah, really good points, all of this. So full disclosure, this is a fake photograph. And if you watch the Patterson-Gimlin film, it'll be very immediately apparent that what you're looking at is a cut and paste from the Patterson-Gimlin film. And just like I think Kevin Hamilton said, all someone did was cut Patty out of the footage and reversed it. And that's partially why you see some weird things like the thinning of the arms. Because to cut out the background of Patty, keep in mind, the subject of whatever Patty is, she's swinging her arms in the footage. So you get motion blur there. And the way that you would make that reduce to make it look like there's not an alien background involved in this image is you have to cut it close. And that means that you have to make some things look kind of weird. So her body looks very smooth here. Again, like someone mentioned, her feet aren't even present. What struck me was the lack of a reflection in the water. And of course, just looking at it and having seen the Patterson films so many times, it's instantly recognizable as a frame from the Patterson-Gimlin film. But again, you have no reflection. You have these weird outlines. So yeah, it's definitely, it might be a bit of a baseline analysis there, but everyone was able to look at that and really kind of get an idea of like, yeah, there are some things that just are not adding up here. I actually have, funny enough, the frame of that right here on my wall. This is the very frame that it seems like they used. So, there you have that. And of course, that's from the actual film itself, or it's a printout of that rather. So that is one example of the kinds of things that we'll be looking at. And, there we go. Yes, all of you get gold stars and A's for that one. Yeah. So that's kind of one of the sorts of activities that I hope to employ in the class. And so the question there is, what did that get people thinking about? And of course, everyone's going to have a different answer for that, I think. But I think part of it too is, someone mentioned, I think it was Robin, mentioned, the story's not tracking here. It looks weird. There's no photos of tracks being given alongside this. It seems too abstract. And you were absolutely right. And right there, you might call like a scrutinization of the narrative. So that isn't exactly physical anthropology or photo editing skills, but what that is it's an analysis of a story, which is a different kind of science altogether. But there comes in cryptoconnectivity. To analyze a cryptid case, you called upon a different branch of knowledge. And I'm sure a lot of you did too. Again, people talking about, look at the lighting. That's a digital science, a graphic design science notion. Look at the lighting. Look for the shadows. Look for reflections. The outlines look kind of weird. Talking about anatomy of animals. Why does the arm look so thin? Why does this look so smooth? Why is the resolution different than the rest of the picture? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, what is that? 4 different branches of science, maybe even 5, were called upon just to examine that one image. So that's significant. That's really interesting. And, JC brings it up. People are not generally taught how to look and truly see. Most never get any teaching on how to investigate and analyze. Right. And all it really takes is a healthy amount of scrutinization to begin that process. And I hope that's what the class can do. Robin says, oh, do you have time to talk about Billy apes? I am not as educated on the Billy ape subject as I should be. I will fully admit that. So Robin, any knowledge you want to drop about the Billy apes, please feel free to, and I'll get to it when I can for sure. So let's go back to the presentation and let's move along. So yes, everyone gets A's in that assignment. So let's see what else we have to work with. Yes, okay, so those are the first 3 classes. This is the 4th and second to last class, which is really the last class that will have big lessons in it. And it's a class, a day, a session that I like to call scientific cryptozoology. And this is kind of where the crux of everything comes together and we see things in cryptozoology change in the sense of, hopefully, the perspectives that people had going in are more informed and perhaps even changed now that we've reached the second to last class. So I would actually like to mention something regarding this. What scientific cryptozoology is, when I say the words scientific cryptozoology, what I mean by that is applying the scientific method to cryptozoology, very much the process that we all just engaged in right there for that one photograph. But it can be branched out to anything, thinking about broad subjects like, generally speaking, the subject of Sasquatch, or generally speaking, the subject of thunderbirds, or generally speaking, the subject of orang pendek, or of the Boehringer, and things like that. We learn as the course goes on the scientific tools that help us to actually take a scientific approach to these subjects. And the goal there isn't to form students' opinions. I would like to make that clear as well, because I don't believe in that. And when I say I don't believe in that, I don't mean that in an opinionated sense. What I mean to say is, it seems to be the case, broadly speaking, that more educational value is actually, practically speaking, achieved if one's opinion is informed rather than created for that person, or instructed. That's the word. Informed rather than instructed. I would like to inform my students' opinions, not instruct their opinions. So that's what this class session would be about. It will be about, I should say. I would also like to note something that I want to correct, actually, about one of my presentations that I did on Alex's channel, this channel, just a few months back. And I want to correct it because I don't know if this will get out there very widely, and it would probably be good if people understood this. That presentation was the top 10 pieces of Sasquatch evidence, or most compelling pieces of evidence for the North American Sasquatch. And one of the things that I mentioned at the end was a DNA study that had been done by a university in California on environmental DNA samples sent into them by the show Expedition Bigfoot. I'd also like to preface this says nothing as far as I'm concerned about the cast, because there is a great divide in information flow between the producers of a show and the cast of a show and other people who work on the show. I was very intrigued with the results, because the results that were sent to the show that the show publicized was a report that said that in the DNA, which was still being tested, they had found that a lot of it seemed to fit the pan genus, which is the grouping of animals that include bonobos and chimpanzees, but that it didn't seem to match either bonobos or chimpanzees, which are the only two recognized pan species, and that there was more testing being done on that. And that was such a phenomenal report to get. That sounded, just so cut and dry, like this is probably an unknown member of the pan genus. So I wanted to conduct a follow-up, and I contacted the department and found that the actual results had in fact come in after further testing, and the results pointed to it wasn't pan-genus DNA. It looked greatly like it because it resembled human DNA but was degraded. So it was degraded human DNA, which at a certain point in degradation can look a lot like the structure of pan DNA. As far as I know, the show did not publish those results. It could be because they weren't out at the time. And you have an air schedule to go with there. But I would like to kind of note to whoever's interested that those are the results of that study. So unfortunately, the Expedition Bigfoot DNA is not something that we can look to. And I had said that it was without knowing the actual results. And there's a good example of why to employ a scientific method, right? Confirm your results if you're going to say something about them. So there's a really great example as to why to include something like I should do as much background research as I can in looking at potentially cryptozoological results. And before I get into more of this, I do want to see how people are perhaps reacting to that. Yes, yeah, there's a good example there with the billy apes talking about, the cultures or the subcultures or subspecies that we're seeing there. Oh, well, thank you, Patrick. I actually do have my own channel. It's called Crash Course Cryptozoology. So there's that. I think someone actually mentioned that, but yes. So we have that, and JC's mentioned we have way too much of teaching the test. This has been going on since at least the 1970s. Learning to think, explore, and create is a very different thing. It absolutely is. I saw a critique recently of what would I say? I suppose of the educational system in particularly the United States, but I'm assuming it expands to a lot of the world, that a lot of it is based around the time period of the Industrial Revolution, in the sense that many of the tasks given to students in educational settings is meant to produce repeated efficiency. And that's fine in an industrial setting. That's very practical and fine. And a lot of jobs are still very industrial. The problem is that something, let's say perhaps like an English professor, or what we're seeing now, which who knows, perhaps this is the emergence of cryptozoology classes. That's not exactly all of it. So there's a missing piece there. And I think that JC is correct in the analysis that, well, I shouldn't say I think, I would say it seems to be the case that JC is correct in pointing out that there's a kind of lack of divergence there. So yes. And there's Robin bringing up a very good point. We can't compare DNA of a Bigfoot if there's nothing to compare it to. I went through that 2 years ago from a university. They refused to do analysis on hair samples. Yeah, it's difficult. And that was the disappointing thing about the sample, actually. In the presentation I initially talked about it in, I was comparing it to the potential results of the Monster Quest Snell Grove Lake DNA. Long story short, it went to 2 labs, one of which said that it was either not a biological sample or that it was contaminated. Perhaps we're seeing degraded human DNA there. Who knows? And the second lab said, actually, it's only partially contaminated. Let's isolate this and look at it. And when they looked at the samples that they said were not contaminated, it resembled human DNA very closely, but had some structural differences. And those structural differences were found in the pan genus, specifically in chimpanzees. So what it seemed like at first was, wow, we have this consistent set of 2 DNA structures over 10 years apart. We have looks like pan genus, don't know where it's from. And then over 10 years later, looks like pan genus, don't know where it's from. Or what it's from, rather. So, but unfortunately, that isn't actually the case. So yeah, it is hard to find this consistent route because, for one thing, you're dealing with something that, by the definition of it, is not agreed upon to exist scientifically. And if that's the case, the idea that you'll be able to compare it to anything is it's just so hard to do that without something that you would know as a concrete sample. Unless you had a Sasquatch specimen in front of scientists that you plucked a hair from and analyzed that DNA, it is so hard to build any kind of model for something that is functionally, in that situation, hypothetical. Yeah, that's one of the scientific difficulties. So let's get back into the presentation here. Because again, this is the second to last class, so we're almost done looking at what this will look like. So all of that goes into this, but we also have methods of scientific analysis that are encourageable to kind of get a rough idea, or at least to postulate, to theorize even, what we're looking at when we look at a piece of alleged cryptozoological evidence. So here's a process that I recently underwent. When looking at a video, it's hard to find, but if you look up playlists related to the Behringer case on YouTube, just tagging the word Behringer with playlist and filters, you'll find this video, and it's called Footprints on the Sand. And it's a video from Australia of a band, I believe, of Aborigine descendants showing tourists around, and they come across these large kind of theropod-like tracks. It's essentially impossible to really ID what animal these tracks come from, and it's very hard. It's almost impossible. And you could probably still argue that it is impossible to know how, the features of the foot that made that track, other than that it is vaguely bird or theropod shaped. And the only question that I thought perhaps could be answered is, well, how long is each track, roughly? And there was only about one frame, which is this frame that we're looking at here. These are 2 copies of the same frame. That gave us perhaps an idea, because you actually have the same angle on these 2 footprints, the footprint of this kind of bird-like or theropod-like animal, and a human footprint next to it. Now, the human footprint comes from a male, because we do see the upper torso of this individual a few seconds afterwards. So my first thought was, okay, I need to understand a bit of anatomy for this. How long is the average male foot? And what I found was that the average male's shoe size for humans who wear shoes is 7.5, which, if I'm not mistaken, and we'll see this in the next slide, is about 28.4 centimeters long. So we know that, roughly speaking, from the heel of the shoe to the tip of the shoe, which is over here, because you can see the dirt mound or the sand mound rather, kind of come up like this, and you see it like that in the next frame as well. This is around, it's in the ballpark of 28.4 centimeters. There's room for error. There's a lot of room for error there. But using some anatomy, we understand the length roughly of the imprint he's making. And so all then we have to do, after we make this line from the heel of the shoe to the tip of the shoe, roughly speaking, do the same with this. And we can actually viably do that because they're at the same angle in this photo and they're not very far apart from each other. You would not be able to do this if this person was stepping perhaps up over here instead, or up over here. The fact that these two things are in line is really kind of a miracle for this study. So then you take those two lines, you make sure that you keep them the same ratio length to each other. So you can see over here, I've opened up and enlarged the lines, but they're still the same proportions to each other. The proportion is what matters. And I've actually broken up the line that represents the roughly 28.4 inches into roughly equal groups. Again, roughly. Maybe we're looking at something more like 30 centimeters here, maybe 25 centimeters, but somewhere in that ballpark. So 4 segments, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We've divided this into 4 segments. We know that one of these black lines, and you can see the dividers if you look closely over here. One of these black lines is roughly, if we break it up into fourths, 6.2 centimeters. Yeah, 24.8, there we go. So here we have like a full diagram of that. And we can actually see that using those same proportions, this is roughly only, the length of this theropod-like track is actually only about another fourth, or I guess what you might call a fifth of its distance, of its length rather, larger than the dimensions of the human foot. And again, all of these are very rough estimates, but we are using anatomy to understand this. So using all of that, we're adding, that extra 6.2 with the black line up here. We're looking at something that's maybe roughly about 31 centimeters, perhaps about 1 foot in length. So just from this one frame, using an understanding of anatomy, reaching out into the webs of cryptoconnectivity, we're able to get a rough size estimate for how big this is. And what this leads us to is the possibilities of, okay, now what we can do is look at the size ranges of the birds that we know exist in Australia. Is there an emu's footprint, a cassowary? Is there a species of bird that we're already aware of that could completely, viably explain the size dimensions of this print? So before I go on, I will go back into what we're looking at here. This is very Thinker Thunker-esque. Yeah, Thinker Thunker is interesting because there seems to be a kind of scientific fall from grace at some point, unfortunately. But I will say that up until perhaps a few years ago, his content was something that was very insightful, is what I will say. Perhaps up until a year or two ago is what I would say. Kind of, but I think this goes way deeper, where Thinker Thunker only gives a rough outline. Yeah, I would say that's true recently. Well, my opinion isn't really the way to go with it. I would say that you could argue that for it, but also for recent, especially as well. And I would also say that even with my view on his newest stuff, I would really recommend looking at his video on the tree tosser footage, because that is, I can't poke any holes in that one yet. And that's some really good evidence if you can't poke any holes into it. So I would certainly recommend looking at that. So let's go back, because we're almost done with the presentation, actually. We're almost done. Because I do want to give another case that really just brings all of that home and just really demonstrates what I would call the unprecedented, or perhaps underestimated power, scientific prowess maybe even, of scientific cryptozoology, the fruits of the labor. This is an animal that was only recognized in the beginning of, I think, 2018 or 2019. And it is called the reticulated siren. It's essentially a bit of an axolotl and a bit of a salamander, as well as, you could argue, a bit of an eel, which is funny because this particular animal was only known in campfire cryptid stories that people were telling in the southern United States up until just, those 2 or 3 years ago. And it was referred to in those campfire legends as the leopard eel. And there was this whole cryptozoological folklore in some areas of the South that there were eels, these weird frilled eels that lived in the marshes, and they were only semi-aquatic. So these eels could actually slither up onto the land, and they had the skin of a leopard, the pattern of a leopard, and they would excuse me, they would dip back down into the water. I got excited there. There was a particular story of a biologist who was driving home one night, I think in Georgia, during a storm, and found part of the road completely flooded with these things as they were, they were removed from the water by the storm and were going back in. He didn't have a photograph or anything. And lo and behold, that story turned out to be true, because the biologist who discovered this animal, whose name is David Steen, knows that person. The story actually happened, and it took quite a number of years to actually get a specimen. But now we understand that what people were calling the leopard eel is actually this new type of salamander-like siren that has this beautiful frill and this leopard skin pattern. What is it that went into this? Well, first off, it was very difficult for David Steen to act. There's a podcast with him that I have, by the way, if you guys want to know the full story. It was very difficult because it was a long process to get a specimen. It was hard to actually get one. If you were just a fisherman, chances are you wouldn't catch one. So there had to be a lot of understanding of the ecology of that area, of the ecology and of the zoology and the behavior of these kinds of animals. 3 different things already that went into this. And this is a genuine cryptozoological discovery. This is a legend come to life. So there, in a perfect little nutshell, is the fruits of scientific cryptozoology laid bare for witness. So that would lead us into the final day of class, which ultimately is a sort of looking back at the other classes that we will have had, and just a review of what we've learned, but also a reflection of what we've learned. How have people's perspective changed? How has thought on the subject diversified over the course of the lecture? What have people learned? What do people take away? What questions are still there going forward, and what new questions have arisen? And, again, all of this connects into crypto connectivity. This is a class essentially not just about crypto connectivity, but kind of looking at crypto connectivity for the scientific application. And I suppose, although I think that this is probably, if not premature, maybe a bit indulgent of me to say, the scientific future of cryptozoology as a legitimate field, understanding it with this model. And that right there would be the end of the class, and it is the end of my presentation. So I would absolutely love to know what other questions some people might have on this. Allow me to look at this. Yeah, Kevin, I think you know what I'm talking about with the tree tosser footage. It is a really good video. It's really interesting. Robin says, I hope you can talk about the proper way to collect evidence, including proper way to take pictures. Yeah, proper way to take pictures and things I've learned just in the field about how to collect biosamples for any field, let alone for cryptozoology. It's very important to preserve that kind of biomaterial. So certainly that will be a subject in class. Robin also says, from fiction to fact animals, giant squids, billy apes, and new or Lazarus species, which he covers in her podcast, how important all undiscovered species are. Exactly, yeah, and that kind of gets to the root of things. And it's funny because I think that I don't have an answer for that kind of thing yet, because I do believe it seems to be the case that cryptozoology and zoology, I should say zoology in this sense, are valuable, but I couldn't give you a reason why. Because knowledge seems to be valuable. General knowledge about the world is valuable. But is that just because we're curious? I'm not sure why. Perhaps it is. But it also allows us to help preserve our planet more. Yes, Kevin. Yes, absolutely. I plan to have a short little segment on pareidolia, as well as introducing a bit of a study I did a while back on how hoax photographs are received on certain platforms. There's a video on it I have on my channel called An Experiment in Gullibility. And it's a video in which I actually photoshopped together a fake Yeti photo and posted it on Reddit cryptozoology pages. And I tracked the types of comments and the amounts of likes and dislikes that I got over a course of 24 hours. And actually what I found is that for a while you have, this rise in this kind of gradual rise in negative reception. So people understanding that it's a hoax without being told, obviously, and more dislikes. And you also have this decrease, which was initially a very big increase in positive reception. And they actually form an X on the graph. So you have a specific point in time where people begin to catch wind that it's a fake. So kind of, I suppose, the social science of hoaxing, as well as you mentioned the kind of, the visual and the psychological science of hoaxes or misidentifications. And thank you very much, Robin. I'm very excited to teach it. If anyone else has any questions, I would absolutely love to answer them. I apologize if this particular presentation felt too much like some kind of class or a college course, but I wasn't quite sure if this could fit in any other kind of fashion, knowing the subject matter. And I really do hope that it's been as informative as it could be on the subject. I don't know if anyone young enough to attend the high school is watching, but I know that there's online course catalogs and that courses can be signed up for. So if anyone's interested in taking it, certainly take a look at that and understand, what the mechanics of that will be. So here we go. Variants of non-existent species are important as well. I encourage people to take photos and submit to iNaturalist on the databases. Yes, absolutely. Variants talking about billy apes, for example, which Robin was doing a bit, is considered to some extent to be a variant of the pangenus, although that is, I think, debated, but at the very least, it is a cultural variation, the likes of which we have never seen before, like ever. Yeah, small variations are really interesting. They're really interesting. Zoology gets down to that small of a level. And just because it's small doesn't mean that it's not important. Darwin observing small differences in finches is what got us to begin really mainstreamly thinking about how biology diversified. So small details are by no means minusculely important. So absolutely, yeah. Center Piper, no, we like it. Well, I'm glad I'm glad that you like it, because I was hoping that it wasn't too boring, I suppose. Kevin Hamilton says, I haven't been in class since the 80s, so it was fun. Well, there you go. You went back to school for a little bit there. Yeah, so if anyone else has any questions or comments to make, I'm probably going to be posting more on the, what would I call them? I don't want to say Behringer tracks, but the alleged Behringer tracks that I showed a diagram of. I'll probably be posting that on Facebook, and I'll also probably do a video on it. So if people would like to kind of understand what the diagram actually means a bit more, that more understanding is coming soon on that. So definitely take a look out for that sort of post coming soon. Patrick McGuire loved it. Wonderful. Thank you, Macy. I had a really fun time. JC says variants are those niche dwellers. Absolutely. And sometimes they can really catch us by surprise, like the leopard eel. So absolutely. Yes, indeed. Yeah. Well, it seems like we're doing good on the time here, and it looks like people have said what they want to say and asked the questions they want to ask. So this is probably a bit shorter than I've usually done on this channel for Aleks, but I will end here, I think. I think this is a good place to end it off. If anyone has any questions about it later, I do have a Facebook, Karac St. Laurent, if anyone would like to kind of ask me more questions about the course. And, someone's asked a question here. Would you possibly involve vocal analysis? Funny enough, I think I will, because that's actually not an easy one to know your stuff on, but it's easy to get an introduction to. There are plenty of websites that help you create spectrograms for audio that you can very easily study. So I'll probably delve a bit into that. Part of giving them, as in my students, research tools that are easy to use, that are more accessible than some might think that they are. So yes, absolutely. Thank you for your support, Robin. It means a great deal to me. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Teflon. It's always an honor to be on Alexander's podcast, because he runs a really great show. as my understanding is that he'll be back next week with another guest. So that will be a return to format there. Yeah, JC mentions, wrong one there. Sonic Visualizer is free and works as well. Wonderful. There you go. Don't forget to teach your class about Professor Robbie Neville's contribution to Bigfoot. So I don't know that joke, but I remember Alexander laughing at that joke the previous live stream, and you have got to let me know exactly what's up with that. I haven't been able to tune into a lot of his live streams, so I'm sure I've missed some kind of wonderful inside joke here. Hopefully not too much of it, but maybe. So there's that. So yeah, everyone, thank you very much for tuning in tonight. It's greatly appreciated. And again, make sure to check out Alexander's channel going forward as well. And if you're interested, happen to check out my channel. If you have any questions, hit me up on Facebook at Karac St. Laurent. And I believe that's it for tonight. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And I hope all of you have an absolutely wonderful evening. Thank you.